last lesson here, the vision of the time of the end, the third part. So the last two lessons leading up to this have been getting us to this point. Now, if you guys recall last week, we spent a good deal of our time dealing with two very prominent groups of people in history. Anybody remember those two prominent groups? We had a king, Alexander the Great, and then he did not have an heir, so his kingdom split into four, the north, east, south, and the west. So we end up with these prophecies about the king of the north and the king of the south. So the line which would be the king of the south, who was that? What were they called? Ptolemies, yes. Yep. And the ones in the north were the Seleucids, right? And so we spent all that time and all that stuff just to basically get down to one individual. Who was that individual? Yeah, Antiochus Epiphanes, right? Was he a nice person? Pretty good person, good fellow? Yeah, he was the worst. You know how they say, oh, that's the worst, right? No, this guy was literally the worst. So we didn't get into every aspect of every single verse. We had to sum up some stuff. If that was a sneeze, bless you. Yeah. And based on what I know, the rest of you need to take cover. Especially you two that are behind her. All right, so. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't say. You're deciding what I mean by that. I'm talking about germs. They circle back. All right, here we go. So. Okay, so we were doing all that to get to Antiochus Epiphanes of the Seleucid kingdom. And one question I did that I was trying to find the answer to and remember. Okay, so what we didn't talk about was Antiochus actually was a prisoner, a slave in Rome for 12 years in his youth. And so was, I believe the name was Demetrius, that was supposed to be the heir. And so we were asking what happened to him. He was actually in Rome and still young, but as a slave, a prisoner. So that had to do partly with why Antiochus was able to weasel his way in, because he was not the rightful heir to the throne, remember? So all that led us to that, and that took us through verse 35. Now, we're going to look at two verses here to get us started because they're extremely important. Okay? So let's look at those two verses in chapter 11. We're finishing up 11 and we're going to roll through 12, Lord willing. So in verse 36, so up until this point, when it's talking about leaders, what are the phrases that are used? We've already said it twice and how they're referenced. When we talk about whoever's leading the Ptolemies or whoever's leading the Seleucids, what are their designations? Okay, say it's the whole thing. The king of the north and south. Yeah. So they're called the king of the north and south. Well, here we have something in verse 36 where things take a bit of a turn. And so we're going to look at those verses. Now, in our introductory material, we'll look at those verses here in just a second. But we've been talking about the vision of the time of the end. And if you remember chapter 10, about how it was just setting up the prophecy and dealing with the spiritual warfare that was taking place. And then we dealt with the nations of Persia and Greece. And then what would happen between the south and the north, Syria and Egypt, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And who was stuck in the middle of all this? Why is this in the Bible? Okay, because this is affecting God's people, Jerusalem, and this is significant. And so at point 4 in our introduction, beginning with Daniel 11:36, there is a large diversity of opinion regarding the identity of the king described and the time in which events described in Daniel chapter 11 through 12:13 would be fulfilled. Now, let's look at verse 36. Verse 36 says, "Then the king will do as he pleases." Anything different so far in that phrase? Okay. So it says, then the king will do as, all throughout this other stuff that we read, it was always what? King of the north, king of the south. So it says, verse 36, then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. Now, I want to go ahead and read verse 40 because, well, let's just read through it. And when we get to verse 40, I need you to pay attention to our pronouns. Okay? Verse 37, and he, so who's the he in 37? The king, right? Will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women, nor he will show any regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. But instead he will honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his father did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. And he, still who? The king, will take action against the strongest of the fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him, and he will cause them to rule over the many and will parcel out the land for a price. And at the end of time, the king of the south will collide with him. Who him? That's the way it reads, right? Okay. And the king of the north will storm against him. Who him? Right? With chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships, and he will enter through countries, and he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through. All right, let's stop there. Okay. So if we read that all the way through, it looks like possibly we've added another king. And so it appears like maybe we have a transition. Now, there are three primary views as to the identity of this king. Now, if you are a premillennial dispensationalist, this is being interpreted at the far end of time, right? At the end of all things. And so this king is said to be whom? Who would you guess? Ooh, no, stand back. Say it. The Antichrist. Yeah, this king here is said to be the Antichrist. They say that this king and that will raise up an army and do battles against the north and the south and all this kind of stuff. And then it all culminates in Armageddon. Because they try to combine this with Revelation and the Antichrist of John. And all along through our whole studies in the book of Daniel, we've rejected that concept for a number of reasons. We could get into a real quick and easy study of why the Antichrist is not an individual and is not somebody that is to be in the future. It's very simple, and you can look at the language in the Greek and in John. It's very clear. There's no such thing as the Antichrist. Not happening. So there's three different views. So the king is Antiochus Epiphanes of Syria. So they're saying that there's continuity here in this scripture, that nothing changes. So then we have to figure out verse 40 then in particular, don't we? Because all along Antiochus has been who? In what we read. You guys remember? Was he north or south? North. Because south was the Ptolemies down in Egypt. Syria was to the north of Egypt. So the king of the north in this case would be Syria, represented by the Seleucids, and Antiochus. So when we get to 40, we read it differently. The hymns and the he's are the same contained in that verse. Okay, we'll get there in a little bit. So the vile and blasphemous ruler described in chapter 11, 21 through 35, the time of his persecution would therefore be 169 to 167 BC, the time of the Maccabean revolt. And a lot of this, when it's related to what we studied last week and in this week, our author Mark Copeland is quoting here Albert Barnes from his commentary. Now, the second view is the king represents the Roman emperors who persecuted Christians in the early years of the church. The time of this persecution would therefore be 60 to 313 AD. So some hold that view. And the third view, the king represents the Antichrist, future ruler still to come. The time of his persecution will be shortly before the return of Christ. That's all tied to the tribulation and the rapture and all that kind of stuff that's part of dispensational premillennial views. Now, there's a fourth view that's out there, and it's not in your notes. But that fourth view would be another individual. So when we evaluate the text, this whole passage, there are certain things which are required of this individual and the time frame and what they would do and who they are. And so here they are. So the criteria that the candidate for the identification of the king must fulfill these things. First, must fulfill the detailed prophecies of 36 through 45. So there must be, when we looked at the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and the way that the scriptures talked and the way it played out through history, was there a lot of correspondence? Or was it just kind of, did it match up? I have failed you. Yeah, let me rephrase my question, because you don't seem too sure about it. Let me put it this way. Did the prophecies that we looked at last week seem to match up with the history we brought out? Okay. No. There was a lot of correspondence there. There was a lot of history that seemed to really fit hand in glove. It wasn't forced. It all, when it talked about giving the daughter and then it would go back, remember all that? That it wouldn't stick, and then all that stuff, that was remarkably accurate. Well, what we find here is we would want that to continue to take place, right? So would we accept any less for this passage concerning identity? No, we still want history to kind of confirm things. And so, of the three views, the overwhelming majority, if those that are not dispensationalists, go straight and just say it's Antiochus, and it's just a continuity. However, there are problems with the historical things matching up. Now, we'll say this. Our author here, who quotes Barnes and George Fall, believe it still to be Antiochus. But Doc Smith, in the things he brings out, says it's likely someone else. So it has to fulfill the detailed prophecy of 36 through 35. So the history has to match up. Must be a king of special interest to the Jewish nation. Must be a king from the latter days of the Jewish state. Must not break the continuity of the entire prophecy. Must be on the scene when Edom, Moab, and the sons of Ammon were still recognizable groups, and must be on the scene when there were still hidden treasures of gold and silver to be found in Egypt. Now, as we go through this, we'll start to look at some of these historical things and see how they match up. But let's think about the time frame here. So when we're dealing with Antiochus, we're dealing with around 169 to 167, right? So BC. So we good where we're at in the timeline there. So the Maccabean Revolution would take place, and eventually you would have things kind of, there's a lot more history that we haven't gotten into. But if we're how far away? We're about 163 years from Christ, right? So historically speaking, are we aware of anything between there and then that could fit the bill? And what's that? Okay, Rome is one of the possibilities here because Rome is coming into power and going to be gaining power and this sort of thing. So it could be Rome. Some think that was one of the things. The king represents the Roman emperors. Okay, but there are some issues with that as well. There was another dynasty that came to be that was actually very influential in special interest to the Jewish nation at the turn of the century, or the turn of the, I don't even know, what do we call that, where it goes? Somebody ever have a name from where it turns from BC to AD? Transition? Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. So if we think about it now, go in your heads to government entities and or powers or leaders that were very influential in and around that time period. Did somebody say something? Okay, those were religious leaders, but this was more political figures. The Herods. So Herod the Great ruled from 40 to 4 BC. From 40 BC to 4 BC. That was when he ruled. Now there were other Herods, the Herodian line that followed his son and grandson are the ones that dealt with John the Baptist and the ones that dealt with Paul and others. So the Herodian dynasty. So Doc Smith thinks that the identity of this king is Herod the Great. Now, so what we're going to do as we look through this, we're going to see how things fit with Antiochus, and we're going to see how things fit with Herod the Great in the Herodian dynasty. So that's kind of the path we're going to take as we move through this. And I think there's a lot of evidence. Now, whether it's Antiochus or whether it's Herod, or whether it's the Antichrist, are either of these answers acceptable or unacceptable? Is Antiochus an acceptable answer? Okay. So let's remember the overarching paradigm for how we've been approaching these prophecies in general. Is Antiochus, if we determine by the end of this, and you're comfortable with it, is Antiochus a reasonable answer? Okay. Yes. Possibly. Earlier or later than that. So if we're not saying that it's locked to a time frame, we're saying it's locked more to an individual, and if it's locked to an individual, then that time frame comes with them. Okay? So would we say Antiochus is a reasonable answer to this? We would say yes. Could Herod the Great be a reasonable answer? If you go back to our overarching principle of saying that we automatically rule out what perspective? Yes, the end times. That this stuff is to be interpreted in terms of the end of all things. And so whether it's Antiochus or whether it's Herod, either one are good and acceptable because they both are fulfilled and completed within the Old Covenant age. Right as the Messianic time frame is being set forth. So either one of those fit well. We categorically reject anything to do with the futuristic dispensational view, and then we lock in on either one of these. So either one of these is acceptable. But I would say that one is probably more acceptable than the other according to the evidence. So let's look at the evidence. So, as you see here, our author says Antiochus Epiphanes seems a likely choice. The allusion in previous verses is undoubtedly to Antiochus Epiphanes. So we could look at these previous verses, and there's a lot of there's a lot of agreement on okay. There's a lot of agreement among scholars that Antiochus, it's a no-brainer. But so there is no indication in the prophetic narrative of any change. So here they say that there's nothing really any different. And this is what George Fall in his commentary has. There's no indication that there's any change. Notice, then the king shall do, and at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. So if we go to verse 40, and you look at this, at the end of time, the king of the south will collide with him, who him, according to this, is the king of the north, who's named after. Now, we don't normally talk like that, do we? Normally, the pronouns are antecedents. I think I'm saying that. Or they have antecedents. The individuals, the specifics of the individual's name first, and then you use the pronouns. Right? Yeah. Wrong. Because what you do, you name the pronouns and expect me to figure out the particulars. You 2 or 3 people, or there's 42 women and you use her. How am I supposed to know who you're talking about? Yeah. Go ahead. During that time, he had rule. He worked with Rome. Okay, you're reading ahead. You're cheating. All right. Verse 40. Right. That is very true. Yeah. So, there would be some that would say that he that follows through all this is Antiochus, all the way through verse 45. Well, we run into problems, especially at verse 41 and 42, because history really doesn't match up well, and I'll explain why here in a little bit. But you're onto something there, because the he of 41 is not Herod. It's someone else. So we'll figure that out. So you're onto something. That's excellent. Okay, so there's then the king shall do, and at the end of the king of the south shall attack him. At that time, Michael in verse 12:1, and at that time your people shall be delivered, 12:1. So they're tying this all to Antiochus and the people being delivered in the Maccabean Revolution. A sudden transition with no given indication is not in accordance with what is usually found in prophetic writings. This is according to Barnes. The word king is never applied to Antichrist. So if you were trying to look at that view, then you would say the word king is never applied to Antichrist. If there, in fact, be the Antichrist, as the Bible speaks of many Antichrists there. So it's a little explanation there of why it's multiple reasons why that can't be. Now, the description that follows can easily be applied to the person in times of Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, this is not to imply there is no difficulty with applying the passage to Antiochus and his times, but I believe it possesses fewer difficulties than the alternative views. Now let's consider what is described to come. So this is just kind of a general description now, so we're going to kind of dig in a little bit here. So verses 36 and 37 talk about the blasphemy of this king. He shall magnify himself above every god. Now this already starts off with a problem for Antiochus. Because, I don't know if you remember this or not, but Antiochus had coinage made. And on one side was his face, and on the other side was Zeus. So some say, well, he didn't elevate himself above Zeus, he worshiped Zeus. And so they say that's an issue right there. That's one objection, which, think of that what you may. Well, speaking blasphemies against the God of gods, prospering till the wrath that has been determined is done, suggesting this was allowed by God as part of the divine judgment of Israel, as was the case of Assyria and Israel back in Isaiah. Okay, now, he shall not regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor any God. Now, this is where it gets interesting. This is where it gets interesting. So, there's speculation about this phrase, nor the desire of women. And so some would speculate that this means that he was celibate, which Antiochus was not, or that the women didn't like him, which was not the case. But if we think of it from this phrase, if we're looking at this, that they said that it could mean that having to do with the goddesses. In regard to Antiochus, he had no regard for the goddesses and the ones that he was exposed to when he was in Roman captivity, when he was a prisoner. Now, with Herod the Great, he was an Idumean, and that means that he was one half Jew. And so it talks about he shall not regard the God of his fathers. That would be the rejection. The God of his fathers could be the Jewish side of his family, or the other side when he was also in dealing with the Roman gods. So where are some of the Roman gods? We've talked about the Greek gods. Where are some of the Roman gods? Yeah, Jupiter, Mars, right? And so that he had no regard for those. Now, this phrase, nor the desire of women. So this is a very interesting take on this phrase when we talk about nor the desire of women, that the desire of women is not necessarily man. In this case, it would be children. Now, what do we know about Herod the Great and his relationship with children? And so Smith believes this is a reference to the what would become the declaration for the massacre of all those infants. That he shall not regard the God of his father, or he will not regard the desire of women. In this case, it would be children. And the slaughter of infants might be in view here, he says. Now, Herod the Great actually had a regard, and eventually, as opposed to Antiochus, who had we talked about his place with the Roman gods, didn't care for him, but Herod did have where it says he shall honor a god of fortresses. Well, a god which his fathers did not know. Some suggest the Roman god Mars or Jupiter. Well, Herod actually, he aligned himself with the Roman Caesars, and that's where he would work out his alliances and stuff and gained his power while Rome was coming to power, and Herod the Great was allowed to do his thing politically and militarily. And so he was working all kinds of alliances as well. Now, we're going to find out some other things here that are quite interesting. So, he shall act against the strongest fortresses with his foreign god, rule over many and divide the land for gain. So, talking about this would still be in the concept of Antiochus, and then possibly this also fits well with what would be happening with Herod. We'll get into a little bit more about what Herod did here in just a minute. So, and that comes into view when we talk about verses 40 and then 41 and 42 and 43. So if we look at this as Antiochus in verse 40, and at the end time, the king of the south, so that would be the Ptolemies, will collide with him being the king of the north, Antiochus, and the king of the north will storm against him, this being the king of the south. See the kind of reverse there? See how that works? It's confusing, right? With horsemen and with many ships, and he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through. Verse 41, he will also enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall, but these will be rescued out of his hand, Edom, Moab, and foremost of the sons of Ammon. So the conquest and end of this king, well, the king of the south of Egypt, now this is speaking in light of Antiochus, shall attack him. Not that this will occur at the time of the end. Now this may help pinpoint the meaning of the latter days of Daniel 10:4. Now, if we're looking at this at the time of the end, either way, whether it's Antiochus or whether it's Herod, this is the last period of Jewish national history prior to the Messianic age. Now, when we look at Herod the Great and the last period of Jewish history prior to the Messianic age, Herod actually gets a lot closer to that time-wise. And so it works very well with the Herodian dynasty, this time at the time of the end that's mentioned. Now the king of the north, if we're looking at this, Antiochus will respond and overwhelm countries, entering the glorious land and overthrowing many, while Edom, Moab, and Ammon will escape. Egypt will not escape. Even Libyans and Ethiopians will submit. So this is what's saying in regards to Antiochus. Now, here's where we look at how this relates to Herod. So when we talk about the king of the north in this case, there has to be somebody else other than Herod. If we're looking at Herod being the him of verse 40, the king of the north then, who would that be at the time of Herod? And so this is where that we look at Augustus was the one who ruled that area, which was Syria at that time. So the king of the north then would be Octavian Augustus. Now the king of the south at this time is very interesting, because we actually talked about this last week. It's Cleopatra, the seventh, who is the Cleopatra that we all know with Mark Antony. So in 31 BC, Herod was an ally of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, and he actually allied with those two and battled Octavian and Augustus. Now, if we look at that and understanding that, that fits. Because in verse 41, this is where we run into a little trouble if we, or not trouble, but we need to understand who the he is here. So, Doc Smith says verse 41 begins a parenthetical section that doesn't continue the pronouns of such that's tied. He says that this parenthetical statement, beginning in verse 41, the he there is actually Augustus, not Herod. So answering your question, Gary, Augustus would be the one that would also enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall, but these will be rescued out of his hand. Verse 41, the he there would be Augustus. Now, this is where it gets a little fishy for me, because why would you switch the way it's reading in that this would mean now mean Augustus, and then it wouldn't continue to be. So if you stick with Antiochus, then the whole way through is him. But in this case, with verse 41, we're saying that this is Octavian or Augustus that would enter the glorious land, and he did deal directly with Edom, Moab, and Ammon. And during that time in 31 BC, Herod also was an ally of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, and he supplied them passage and goods and military to battle Octavian and Augustus. Now, 42 and 43 talk about then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape, but he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver. And this was indeed true of Octavian and Augustus. Okay, but then it clicks back in verse 44 to Herod, according to this understanding. Because then it talks about he shall come to his end. The he now is Herod the Great. Now this is interesting. In verse 44, it says, "But rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him." Now, think for just a second. Well, what rumor from the east might trouble Herod? Where did Herod get that news? From the Magi. The news from the north, we have recorded that Herod's sons, who were in Rome, they had some issues there, and things weren't going so well. And we'll talk about that. They received a letter from Herod's sons in Rome, and this is what happened. So I want to share with you what he has here on that. So now, there's a lot of good information here if you want to read in this and study it. We just don't have time to get into all of it. But talking about Augustus and his expedition against Edom and Moab that was well accounted for, as well as his attack on Egypt, and how he eventually, that Cleopatra wanted to keep all the battles out in the naval, and she was moving all of her wealth and so forth and so on, and she threatened to burn it. But Herod convinced her not to. But then after everything was said and done, Augustus was afraid that she would set fire to these treasures. He continued to send messages, and Augustus took possession of all the wealth of North Africa sometime after that. The account of how Augustus acquired the fabulous treasures of Cleopatra is related by Plutarch, the historian. Now, talking about the king's demise, talking about the paranoia, the tidings out of the east troubled Herod probably referred to the news brought by the Magi. The tidings from the north came in a letter from Herod's son in Rome. This letter reported that two of his other sons, whom Herod had decided to appoint as his successors, had written a bad report to Rome about their father. Okay? So the two other sons wrote a bad report about their father to Rome, and how do you think Herod felt about that? What do you think he did? He had him killed. Now, here's what else happened. In verse 44b, and he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly sweep away. We didn't read these verses. But rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. And he will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. Okay, to protect his throne, Herod ordered the slaughter of the Bethlehem innocents. About the time of the report from Rome, Herod ordered 40 men buried alive. They had pulled the Roman eagle down from the temple gate. Herod's great fury against his sons and others is related by Josephus in the Antiquities. Now, Herod's punishment. Do anybody recall what happened, how Herod died? Well, we know that Antiochus, that's what happened to him, but Herod, okay, so you're onto something there, Doug. Tents when we talk about the tents, tents may refer to the glorious aggregate of transportable accommodations that Oriental monarchs often took along on expeditions. On the other hand, tents may stand for permanent accommodations. Herod had 2 palaces in Jerusalem, one in the temple area and one in the upper city. The sea is literally the seas, probably the Mediterranean and the Dead Seas were intended. The glorious holy mountain is Mount Zion or Jerusalem. Now Herod's in. He shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Though he would be successful for a time in dominating the Holy Land, the king Herod shall come to his end. Herod's terrible end is described by Josephus. He literally rotted away after he suffered convulsions. And Herod ordered that the Jewish leaders be executed upon news of his death, and in order that there be mourning at the time of his funeral. The orders were not carried out. Ultimately, tyrants die alone. There are no comforters, and few mourn their passing. So, there's evidence that that this could be Antiochus, because there's some things that fit and some things that don't. And there's evidence that this could be Herod, because there's some things that fit and some things that don't. Now, I think where we get into chapter 12 even more fits with Herod. Okay? So, at chapter 12, verse 1, it says, Now at that time, Michael, the great prince, who's this? Yeah, the angel, right? Who stands guard over the sons of your people will arise. Now, it says, now at that time. What time? What time are we talking about? That's an important question, right? So, when we talk about that time in the Herodian dynasty, there has to be something that's happening at this time that's going to need to be consistent. So let's read and keep that in mind. At that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. Okay, when we read about Antiochus, was it terrible time? Okay, and so it was unlike anything they had ever experienced. But would this be the only time in Israel's history that something like this occurred? A period of time like they had never experienced? Yeah, when Rome conquers in 70. Okay? Since there was a nation until your time, and at that time your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but to others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. And those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. So these first 4 verses, there's a lot in here if we really look at it. Now, to occur at that time, well, to be assisted by Michael, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people in a time of trouble not seen before, deliverance of Daniel's people at that time, the time just previously described, the time of the conflict involving Antiochus Epiphanes. So that's where they say that this likely occurred. Well, when we talk about occur at the last time, if we do say that verse 36 over here changes to Herod the Great, then what we'll need to see here is that within the Herodian dynasty, the beginning with Herod the Great, concluding with the Roman war in AD 68 and 70 would be at that time. Now many who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. What's this sound like? Judgment Day? When Christ came? Well, what does this sound like? I mean, don't tie it to a specific a specific event, but just many who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. What's it sound like? Look at it narrowly. Okay, right? It sounds like something rising from the dead, right? Now it says many. Turn to Matthew chapter 27. Matthew 27, verse 50. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split, and the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. Now, look at the words. I mean, are there any correlations between this and that? What words match up? Many? Yeah, which implies what? They was asleep. Yeah, and the many of the bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. Verse Daniel 12:2, many who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. It's pretty striking correlation, isn't it? Now, yes. Well, it'd be the next Herod, his son. So it's contained within the Herodian dynasty that would take us up through 70 AD. So, but beginning with Herod the Great, and then at that time when basically the messianic age comes into being. Yeah, I'm trying to remember I came across them in here, the names of his sons. Keith's probably got a fancy chart in his Bible, has it all worked out for us. He hadn't said a word. But I want to get a copy of that. I looked online for it, and I couldn't find anything, but I really would like a copy of that. Because you have Cleopatra the Seventh down eventually. Yeah. And around the time of Herod. Is Herod on that at all? It's just, he's on your chart too? Gosh. I got to get me one of them. Okay, so what we have here, many who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. So anytime we have a judgment or anything like that, it's spoken of in Scripture and many other places of those that are resurrected to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. That language is used a lot in different places. Now, no, this is not likely the physical resurrection of the dead, for then all, not many, shall be raised. So what that point here is saying, we're not talking about the resurrection at the end. And so that's within the context of Antiochus. Within the context of Antiochus, they take this to be metaphorical. And that metaphorical would be down here, using the figure of the resurrection may depict the Maccabean revolt, where the Jews came out of the caves of the mountain hideouts to resist Antiochus. So that's figurative in this case. Yes? Okay, yeah. Well, do we know that the ones that rose were saints? In Matthew, does it say that? Did it say the saints? Okay. Well, let me... Yeah, let me pull that up. Okay. Those who insist that this verse refers to the final bodily resurrection from the dead labor to prove that many does not indicate a partial resurrection. It means numerically many. There was, however, a time when this very language was used of partial resurrection, Matthew 27:50 through 53. A partial and physical resurrection of bodies from the graves around Jerusalem was the exclamation point on a ministry that been calling forth people. I'm sorry, there's a typo in here. Well, that's throwing me off. There's two that's in a row there. Was the exclamation point on a ministry that had been calling people forth from spiritual deadness. Of them has been understood in two ways, and that many out of all who sleep, or many from the state of sleeping, the latter is probably correct. So, resurrection of sleepers. Those involved in this resurrection are literally called sleepers of or in the land of dust. Death is frequently compared to sleep. Dust of the earth is figurative of the grave. Now, is this entire expression speaking of physical death? The language is sometimes applied to those in a state of moral or spiritual indifference, nationally as well as individually. The sleepers are primarily those Jewish people to whom John, Jesus, and the apostles preached in the time of the end, God dealing with national Israel. The verse, however, can be applied to sleepers in the broader sense of any people who have not heard the gospel. So, the language there is tricky because we know it's tricky. We know very little about those that came out of the grave on that day, but if they were saints, then they were resurrected to eternal life, not in that moment, but in a grander scale. Because eventually they would have to die again, wouldn't they? I mean, do we know anything else out of those from the Matthew 27? Did they die again? Were they? Interesting. So there wasn't their physical bodies that came out of the grave? That's interesting. No, that's something that's very, very interesting. Go ahead, Rob. Interesting. But we do know that there is that language is used in a couplet like that. There's always this idea of eternal good judgment and eternal bad judgment. And so now talking about an awakening is not just a physical awakening, but that it's also speaking of a moral and spiritual awakening caused by the preaching of the gospel, which would now take place in the days of the Herodian dynasty. The whole nation of Israel was awakened out of the sleep of centuries through the preaching of John the Baptist, Jesus, and the New Testament apostles and evangelists. So it's also, Doc Smith says, not just it's an awakening of spiritual sorts through the preaching of the gospel in that time. Now, yeah, we don't have time to get into it. Okay, so there's two ways to look at this in the context of Antiochus. Then it would be using the figure of the resurrection. This may depict the Maccabean revolt where the Jews came out of the caves and mountain hideouts. Or if it's in the time of Herod, we could look at this Matthew 27 passage as well as understanding that there's a spiritual awakening that's happening as a result of the Messianic age coming to be, the preaching of John the Baptist, and also the apostles which would follow. Now, there were final instructions and answers given to Daniel. So this is where we get back into how long is this going to happen? Daniel has questions that are going to be answered, and we come again to this phrase, which we'll just talk about quickly, was the time, times, and a half a time. Now, if you go to verse Is that where it says that? No, here it is. Yeah, verse 7. Middle of 7. The one stretched out his hands and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. We've talked about this in the Revelation class and early in Daniel. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. So, shattering the power of the holy people, did that occur under Antiochus? Yes. More completely, in Rome, right? With the destruction of the temple and basically Judaism as a whole in 70 AD. Now, go down to verse 11. And from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains the 1,335 days. Well, what does that all mean? I'll just quickly say this. When we're talking about the time and a half a time, that's a period of about 3.5 years. Well, the beginning point of was when Rome attacked, was it all like just blitzed in and destroyed them and left? How did it take place? It began a siege over how much time? It was over 3.5, or a little over, just under 3.5 years. Yeah, and that's when it talks about the abomination of desolation, is when Jesus said, when you see this, to what? Get out. And we know that Christians did, but those who didn't were stuck there in the siege, and what happened to one? It was terrible, right? Now, listen to this. This is the part that blows my mind. This is those who wait. Okay, so we talk about that 1,290 days. So, where'd you go? Okay. Now, the angel specified the length of the time between the two pivotal events as 1,290 days. There's nothing in the Hebrew text to suggest which of the two events would come first. 43 months after the abomination that causes the desolation was set up, i.e. the Roman armies surrounded Jerusalem, the daily sacrifice ceased. According to Josephus, the Roman armies approached Jerusalem on the 27th day of the month of Hyperbarataios. About a 14 letter. Why can't it just be May? All right, it's actually October, okay? AD 66. So they have it down to the day, according to Josephus, right? Listen to this. So October 27th, AD 66, the siege began. Under the pressure of the siege, the daily sacrifice was suspended July 13th, AD 70. The following month, Titus, the Roman general, forced his way into Jerusalem. He utterly destroyed the place. The city was finally put to the torch in August 6, AD 70, 3 years and 8 months, equaling 1,335 days. October AD 66 was the 27th day. And then July 13th, AD 70 is when the sacrifices ceased, and then utterly destroyed August 6, AD 70. Thus, the 1,290 days represent the period of most intense suffering for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So, whether it's verse 36 turns to Herod the Greater, it stays with Antiochus, either way, we're still good. We're still locked into the right place here. Now, if you want to study this a little further, if you want to dig into that, I can get you some more stuff. We are out of time. Basically, we've kind of covered the important things of this and kind of have an understanding of all these different symbols. When we go back and talk about the 4 different beasts and the lopsided bear and the goat and the he-goats. Yeah, and the vision of the rams and the goat and all that stuff, I feel like we've got a pretty good understanding of it. Not complete, but any questions or comments about anything we covered. I know we went through that last part really fast, but we just kind of had to.
I have a question about the Antichrist.
Yeah.
Would it be a justifiable argument to say, how can the Antichrist be before the Christ?
Because of the days and stuff that are here.
Because of the way that it's
Talking about the 1200 and the time, half time. Yeah, that's one of the things you talk about is how can this be what they do. If you guys recall the 70 weeks, and when they said that we had that beginning period and we were left with the 1 week, they say that 1 week would be into the future, way into the future, in the vision of the week, so that they would say they would place these things happening in that context to push it all forward. So it's one of those things where they kind of have the bases covered, I think, but still, when we understand, I believe, the way that these prophecies are meant to be understood, as well as Revelation, there's no room for it anyway. But there is something to the order of things if you can't have that, like you were saying. Okay.